Hey everyone! What you're seeing in the background is a side project I've been working on for the past few weeks. Or maybe months. Point is, during summer I wanted to just make a small game, and I didn't really care about originality, so here's what I came up with. Basically, it would be something like Pong, but with two crucial differences. Number one, there would be more projectiles, because, I mean, come on, one ball is not enough. But the issue is that this would create situations where the game is impossible. So change number two, there would also be more paddles. But not just pre-placed paddles, no. You would get to place them. And you would get to keybind them to the keys that you like, and then you could use these during the game. So there wouldn't just be strategy in actually playing the game, but also in where you place your paddles. Anyway, here I am a couple of weeks later, and well, let's talk about how that went. So obviously, when you're making a clone, the first thing you have to do is remake the original. And so here's Pong, and amusingly it worked first try, which really surprised me. It's probably a good time to note, I'm not using a game engine, I'm literally making this in pure JavaScript, which is a horrible mistake, I know. But this means that even mundane things like collisions have to be made from scratch, and it's the collisions that were a pain in the butt. When I was originally brainstorming the idea, I had these rotating paddles in mind, and so a normal rectangle to circle collision system wouldn't really work because the rectangle is rotated. And so I spent 3 days working on a collision system, and it didn't work anyway because I was doing it in the dumbest way possible. Finally, I decided to actually Google the issue at hand, and I found out that there's actually an algorithm for circle to rotated rectangle collisions. I had no idea it existed, and I also have no idea why I didn't Google it earlier. Anyway, for anyone interested, the way it works is you basically rotate the whole scene around the pivot of the rotating paddle, and then you do normal circle to rectangle collisions. So if the paddle is like this, you just rotate it down here, and now it's no longer rotated. So Pong works, spinny thing works, and I can also add paddles in code. I think we've got a decent setup here. Controls were a major concern right from the beginning. The original idea was that players would get 4 pairs of keys, and you could bind any of the paddles on your side to any of those pairs. You could obviously bind multiple paddles to the same keys. In theory, this is a great idea, but in practice, well, issue is, humans suck at multitasking. Or maybe it's just me. No, seriously, I did a test run just using 2 normal paddles. And this didn't make the game any easier. I kept missing because I was concentrating on the wrong ball. So the first idea to solve this was to make the placeable paddles really simple. The game would be less about multitasking and more about picking which paddle to use at the moment. Thing is, other than the spinny paddle, I really had no idea what types I wanted, so the game kind of led me to where it is now, I guess. The first paddle that I came up with was the triple paddle. Instead of it moving at some speed, it just teleports on one single key press. So when you see a ball coming to this top area, you just move the paddle there and can move on to bouncing off other projectiles. This wasn't completely ideal, but it did make the game easier, and I'll come back to it in like 6 sentences anyway. In the meantime, I added the placement system, which has this really good animation. So far, all the paddles are bound to the keys E and D, but I'll work on that. I also downscaled the paddles because they were a bit too big. And then I forgot to record for like 2 days. Quite a lot has changed, mainly the already mentioned controls. I basically cut the amount of controls you use in half, and so placeable paddles, as you can see, are only controlled with 1 key instead of 2. Obviously the back paddle is still controlled by a pair of keys, but that's the only one. So the triple paddle is only assigned the key R, and when I press it, the paddle moves up, and then when it's at the top, it just cycles back to the bottom. This change made the game substantially more playable, because you weren't fumbling around with the keys every 2 seconds. Also, in placement mode, you can now cycle between the different keybinds by clicking on the paddle. Speaking of paddles, I also did some work on a new one. Well, it's more of a force field. Basically, when you press its assigned keybind, it shoots out this wave and yeets projectiles away. Also, you may have noticed that the spinny things now spin constantly, and pressing their assigned keybind just reverses the direction they spin in. Actually, now that's kinda useless. So I made them rotate 1/8 of a turn every time you press their key, which is also useless, but at least the collisions don't bug out. The last paddle I made was this destructible one. Basically, it consists of multiple segments, and when a projectile hits one of them, it destroys it. But by tapping its assigned keybind, you can regenerate the segments. And you may just think, I'm just gonna tap that key 24/7. Fact is, at some point you'll forget. And by the time you realize, the paddle is going to be completely gone. Oh, and fun thing, if a ball hits it from the top, this happens. Not intentional, but it's kind of funny. Oh, and I also made sure that you couldn't place paddles inside one another. That's kind of useful. So now that we have 4 paddles and the game actually works, I thought I'd work on the game's looks. Obviously, I'd still have to finish Projectiles, but I'll get to that. Originally, I wanted the game to look really old school and give it this CRT effect with grain, lens distortion, chromatic aberration, but JavaScript is really weak and it just cannot handle that. So I just went for chromatic aberration and these horizontal lines. Even just the chromatic aberration slows the game down because you basically have to redraw the whole screen again. And so I tried to optimize it and that led to these cool effects. Anyway, that was kind of done, but I'll get back to it later. Okay, now we do projectiles. So the first one I added was this exploding one. It stays green for some time, then turns orange, and eventually starts blinking red, and then it explodes into a bunch of normal projectiles. Then there's this invisible one, which is green, and every now and then it goes invisible. It also appears just as it's about to score a point, so that you can see that it scored a point, but it's also kind of too late to do anything about it. And the final one I added was this square which spawns normal projectiles out of its sides. And that basically completes the objectives I gave myself. So here's some gameplay before I do polishing up. Up until this point I had been playing against my sister, but she was getting too good, so time for AI. Originally I wanted some complicated system, but turns out targeting the closest projectile works pretty well. I mean, it literally won against a big wall, so yeah. Obviously I had to make different AI for each paddle, and all of them worked except for the spinny paddle, which was starting to get on my nerves. It's kinda useless, and it's dumb, and it doesn't even work. And it also gave me a crisis because I spent 4 hours trying to fix it, only to realize that modulo is the same in the order of operations as multiplication. It's not PEMDOS, it's PEMDOS. Once I fixed that, I was really happy, as you can see by the enthusiastic cursor waving. To finish things up, I realized that the CRT effect is kind of weird, and that the game looks so clean without it, so I added an option to turn it off. I also tried making music, except that's kind of hard, so scratch that. But I did add sound effects, which was just me spitting in the microphone, but it sounded okay, so. I also had to add menus and work on the difficulty, and all of these small changes which influence the game, but you can't really see them. Speaking of difficulty, I ended up making the screen smaller so that balls wouldn't get stuck in the middle for hours, and also just to make the game more exciting. Balancing it was kind of hard. In the end, I only made the exploding projectile shoot out 4 balls, and I made the shooting one only shoot out 2 balls. The game is still quite difficult, but it's a lot of fun, mainly when you play it with your friends. Oh wait, it's 2021, and there's that thing, and you can't meet your friends. Oh. Anyway, if you want to play it, obviously alone, it's on itch.io. And yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll leave you with some footage of me losing. Oh, and by the way, the rotating paddles still don't work, but I just gave up at this point.